All right, in this chapter, we're going to look at male serial killers. So most of the data that our author is talking about comes from the 2004 to 2014 update he did to his study. So just remember back in chapter 1, we talked about how there's a lot of comparison in the book through the first set of data to the second set of data. And we talked about why that is not suitable to make those comparisons. So about 76% of all serial killers are men who kill alone, okay? So about 205 out of 270 in this study. In terms of racial breakdown, recall that as we have changed the definition of serial killers, right? So as the FBI has begun counting them at 2 killers, right? That's kind of changed the demographics of the offenders. So roughly half are African American, about 40% Caucasian. The average age of an offender at first killing is around 30, and their average age at which they're actually caught is 38. On average, they spend about 8 years killing. And the total number of victims is anywhere between, in this study, 766 and 955. And recall, the reason we don't have exact numbers, right, is that sometimes we can confirm that certain murders took place. And sometimes we know, like, oh, killer X committed 10 murders for sure, possibly up to 16, right? So that's going to account for that range. On average, these offenders have around 3 or 4 victims. The time frame in this study from which they were offending dated back to 1965. And of course, our study ends in 2014. About 40% killed all their victims in the same year, and about 61% killed them over a longer period of time. So you can see 30% here over a 10 plus year period. Now, the most common method of killing in this particular study was shooting only. Oh, sorry. Shooting only was about 37% of the cases. Strangling only was 21%, but 28% is some combination of strangling, beating, stabbing, and or shooting. Now, some killed adults only, and that's the overwhelming majority of these offenders, about 94%. About 9% killed adults and children. About 91% targeted specific types of victims. About 61% killed strangers only. About 15% killed prostitutes. About 23% killed men only. 42% killed women only. And just under 20% killed in more than one state. Now, post-World War II, we start to see some changes, and there's an increase in serial murders that sharply accelerates during the late 60s and into the 70s. During the 1980s, serial murder starts to be studied more by social scientists and becomes an increasing concern for police and other law enforcement agencies. By the 90s, several law enforcement agencies had begun addressing multiple homicide, so not just serial killing, but mass shootings as well, and mass murder, through more training, more in-service, and colleges began offering courses on this particular type of homicide. In the 2004 study, right, so that's the older study, 96% of serial killers began killing after 1900. Now, in recent years, there have been serial killers that have emerged who just didn't capture a lot of media attention. And part of that is because most of the new cases, they don't have the drama, they don't have the high body counts to be of more serious public interest. So we do know that there's a decline, right, in since that 60s, 70s, 80s period in law and in serial killings. And so today, right, some of the reasons for this, we have much more advanced technology. So, you know, it was much easier for Ted Bundy to escape and manage to make his way across the country to kill women in Florida than it would be today. So it's a little harder to stay undetected today. Homicide investigators also collaborate now with other agencies, where in the past, right, especially pre-computers, we didn't really have any way to know what was happening even in the next town over. We know more about offenders and victims, and so we're able to use that profiling information. Cold cases are being solved. You guys might be familiar with the Golden State Killer, who started out as a serial rapist and then became a serial killer. And he was caught a few years ago using familial DNA. We might also be seeing fewer killers because perhaps some potential would-be offenders are using the internet as a way to vent those fantasies instead of finding actual people to kill. We know more about sexual preferences and paraphilia, and the public is more aware of the dangers of violent predators. And finally, baby boomers are aging out. Okay, so the baby boomer generation are the babies that were born after folks came home from World War II. And they were a pretty large population, right? And one thing that we do know about crime is that when you have a large young population, when you have many more young people, your crime rates are going to go up. When you have fewer young people, your crime rates are going to go down. So the baby boomers are aging out. Well, they've definitely aged out. What has also changed too is what a serial killer looks like today versus in the past. So between 2004 and 2011, male solo offenders used guns as their sole or one of their main methods of killing. This is in about 38% of cases. Between 2011 and 2014, guns were used in 71% of cases, and 46% of the time as the sole means of killing. Where there were many victims in the past, 10 to 13 per offender, now we have about 3 to 4 per offender. So what's really changing is methods of murder and motives are changing. So the sort of carnage that we saw with like Bundy and Kemper and Gacy may have really dissipated. We also know, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, right, that the FBI changed their definition. So we're no longer waiting for three victims to be deemed a serial killer, right? So this has resulted in many more cases and cases that are deemed quote unquote less newsworthy. So your author talks about how there was this period where there was a rise in serial killings, right? And so what might be playing a role in this? Well, some people believe that there was this new breed of predatory criminals developing. We also know with this change in the FBI definition, right, that perhaps in the past, if we went back and we started including all the homicides that involved 2 or more people, we would probably see that our baseline from before was much higher. When we focus specifically on serial crimes and serial killing, right, we get a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we look for a certain thing, and that's what we expect to find, that is what we find. There's been some inconsistency in defining what constitutes serial killings. The media has had a proliferation of movies, films that are really focused on serial killers. Could also be an increase in pornography depicting violence and other erotic material, and the fact that that pornography is much more easily accessible. Also, a belief that changes in the economy are connected to surges of violent behavior, and feminist belief that serial killing is an extreme form of male domination of women based on patriarchy. Now, we've always sort of had this stereotype, right, that serial killers are male, that they kill women, that they travel, and that they're white, okay? But between 2004 and 2015, about 45% of all serial killers were Black, and 52% of all male solo serial killers are Black. This increase, again, may be due to those changes in the FBI definition. Chicago produced 3 Black serial killers in 2000 alone. Now, many Black victims also go unnoticed, and another thing to keep in mind is that most serial murders interracial. So white on white, Black on Black, Latino on Latino. So it's generally not interracial. We also know there's this belief, right, that serial killers are roaming the country and they're going from state to state. But male offenders who roam the streets are relatively rare, right? Most remain close to their killing sites. And since 1975, over 74% of male offenders have been local killers. Only about a quarter killed in more than one state, and about 10% use their own homes and places of employment as kill sites. Now, more recently, the FBI has developed the Highway Serial Killing Initiative to identify victims of traveling serial killers. And over the past 30 years, remember this book is published in 2016, there's been over 500 bodies of victims found alongside or near freeways and highways. And we can see here, this from 2009 to 2011, just a map of places where um, victims have been found alongside highways. Now, the FBI has this database of over 275 suspects in highway murders. Almost all of them are long haul truckers, long haul truckers. Now, your author talks about this, about prostitutes that frequent truck stops and that they're often referred to as quote unquote lot lizards. That's disgusting, and we're not going to use that term, okay? But there are prostitutes who frequent truck stops, and they obviously would be easy targets for these offenders who are very mobile. About half of victims in this study were truck stop prostitutes in this highway database. Others that are in this highway serial killer database as victims: stranded motorists, hitchhikers, and people who just accidentally come into contact with these killers. Now, here we have this kind of breakdown again, right, where we've got 1800 to 2014, right, which is the whole period that Hickey has studied, and then just this more recent period from 1975 to 2014. And we can kind of see, in 1800 to 2014, about 30% of victims were multi-state, and about 28% of offenders, and we can see that those numbers have dropped. Right, so now it's all right. The number of victims is still, it's a wider range, but still roughly around 30. But the percentage of multi-state offenders has dropped to 22%, and you can see that the percentage of one-state offenders has bumped up from 72 to 78%. Now, one thing we know is that serial killers often stalk their victims, but stalking wasn't a crime until 1990, when California passes the first law. And they passed the first law after the murder of Rebecca Schaeffer, who was a young actress on a TV show called My Sister Sam, and she was killed by a stalker. And so there's three elements to stalking. One is a pattern of harassment over a period of time. It's a pattern of implied or explicit threats with the intent to harm, intimidate, or create great emotional stress. Now, that sounds like that would be easy to prove, but it's actually kind of difficult. Now, the LAPD has a threat management unit, and they have classified stalkers into 4 different categories. Simple obsessional, which is where the offender knows his victim and stalks as a result of some perceived mistreatment or separation. Love obsessional is stranger to stranger, and the offender harasses the victim to draw attention to himself. Erotomania typically involves a celebrity, and the offender believes that the celebrity is in love with them. These are generally female offenders. And then false victimization. And this is where an offender falsely accuses another person, real or imaginary, of stalking him or her in order to assume the role of victim. Now, Hickey's come up with his own, and he's got domestic. So these are cases where victim and offender know each other, stranger, and then false victimization ones. So the first one is domestic, right? So where they know each other. Power anger stalkers. These offenders tend to harbor feelings of hatred, revenge, and domination over their victim. But they're not obsessed in any kind of clinical sense. They often are unable to manage their personal or public life. This creates a state of perpetual frustration and anxiety. And this is the most common type of domestic stalker, and most likely of the domestic stalkers to actually commit physical harm against the victim. The victims are usually women caught up in dysfunctional relationships who leave their husband, boyfriend, etc., because they fear for their own safety. Enraged, the offender often begins a campaign of relentless pursuit by harassing, threatening, assaulting, and in some cases, killing the victim. So this is sort of a relationship has ended, and the significant other is not really accepting of that and begins stalking the person. This can become particularly dangerous. Now, a domestic obsessional stalker usually has less obvious motivations. Victims can be former friends or lovers, coworkers, acquaintances, and relatives. These folks often have psychological disorders like personality disorders or schizophrenia, and they become fixated on the victim and relentlessly pursue them. For the victim, contact with this offender becomes a series of frequent phone calls, letters, gifts, following, and harassment. This offender will often make claims that the victim wants to be with them and they're meant to be together. In other instances, the offender might believe the victim is an enemy who's plotting to harm them and who must be stopped. Now, stranger power anger stalkers are primarily men, and they are obviously seeking out random victims to control, intimidate, and harm. They also exhibit antisocial characteristics, and they hunt for proxy victims upon whom they can vent their anger. In times of economic hardship, these men often turn to others upon whom they place the blame. Now, stranger obsessional stalkers, again, right, we've got this variety of psychological disorders, including paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar, and dissociative disorders. These offenders should generally be considered dangerous because they're very unpredictable. Now, the object of their attachment is a stranger. And they attach because they've come to learn or believe something about another person that may be completely false, but they see as a catalyst for the attachment. Now, the internet becomes an attractive tool for them because it provides them unlimited access to their victims. Now, stranger sexual predator stalkers are some of the most dangerous offenders, right? So these include rapists, pedophiles, child molesters, paraphiliacs, and some of these evolve into serial killers. These guys are always dangerous because the outcome is frequently the actual sexual assault of a victim. And these offenders frequently have criminal histories. They have psychopathic characteristics, act alone, and become very adept at using tools like the internet to find victims. Now, most serial killers who are not strangers to their victims tend to be power, anger, or obsessional types. And those who are strangers and stalk their victims are usually power, anger, obsessional, or sexual predators. Now, stalking can involve non-site stalking, where you have no direct contact with your victim, and site stalking, where you do have contact. And as you can see, obviously, site contact would involve like following someone, going to their work or their house. We might see signature behavior, leaving gifts. And non-site contact would involve phone calls, messages, letters, gifts, any use of social media, instant messaging to contact somebody. Now, non-site stalkers obviously create a great deal of fear, but they usually don't pose a physical danger. They are able to get some sense of power and control over the victim, and many would not actually feel comfortable with any direct contact. But some do escalate to site stalking. Site stalking, that direct contact fulfills physical and sexual fantasies. So law enforcement needs to understand that those stalkers are really a Pandora's box of physically and psychologically dangerous behavior. Now, cyber stalking isn't necessarily a different category of stalking, it's more a different method, and it's most likely to be committed by strangers. And as you can imagine, any internet tool that we have is useful for cyber stalking, right? So texting people, email, Twitter, using someone's GPS, right? We're hearing a lot of stories now about the Apple AirTags. So a lot of sex offenders um, engage in fantasy, okay? And that plays a crucial role in their offending. And that's true also for a lot of serial killers. Stalking fantasies prepare them for opportunities to actually stalk their victims. And the more focused and detailed those fantasies are, the greater the danger they pose. Now, in terms of victims, about 84% of all male offenders since 1975 killed at least one stranger. Generally, these are young women, especially if they're alone, that are the most common victims. We often hear stories, right, that male serial killers want to kill their mothers, and they often usually then have a proxy victim, right? So they find themselves killing someone else. So in terms of victim offender relationship, right? So in the entire study, right, about 79% of offenders are strangers. That has increased to about 84% in the last almost 50 years. Now, since 1975, about 1 in 5 offenders attacked and killed victims who had, quote unquote, facilitated their own deaths by placing themselves at risk. I want to take a minute here to talk about how in criminology, we do often talk about victim precipitation, victim facilitation, how a victim has placed themselves at risk. I want to be clear that this is not victim blaming, and I don't really like the terminology that our author's using here, victim facilitation. I prefer for you to think about it as ways in which victims might have, or behaviors that victims might have engaged in that place them at higher risk. Now, in terms of, we got a breakdown here for the entire study as to like age, right? So 62% of offenders only killed adults, 41% only killed women, and then we can see, right, that generally there's some sort of combination. Right, so in terms of strangers, we can see here how risk facilitation might play a role, right? So look at this first group, right? It's young females that are alone, right? So if you're alone, obviously that puts you at higher risk for all types of crimes, right? If you're going to choose to victimize someone, you're not going to choose to victimize someone who has friends with them, right? You're less likely to be successful. But if you look at this group of high-risk young females, prostitutes, hitchhikers, etc. Children who are alone, right? Generally, we don't leave children alone. Then people who are traveling, right? Young males alone, etc., etc. In terms of acquaintances, young women, people in the community. In terms of family, wives are number one, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? Because we know what we know about domestic violence. So as I mentioned, since 1975, 1 in 5 offenders attacked and killed victims who were engaged in risky behavior. Now, most of these victims at the time are unaware of the danger. And we can see here kind of a breakdown as to whether or not someone was low risk, high risk, whether or not offenders killed low risk victims or high risk victims or a combination. Okay, and so we can see that over time, right, towards the end of this period, the last 50 years or so, the percentage of low risk folks has decreased, and we've seen an increase in high risk victims. Now, male serial offenders compared to other types of homicide offenders do not commonly use guns as their sole method, right? For some offenders, what they're really getting off on is the response of the victim. Okay, so that torture and killing someone without the torture element is really just kind of going through the motions. In terms of backgrounds, occupations, and education of serial killers, there's this belief, right, that they're sort of super intelligent. We often think of Ted Bundy, who was attending law school, but often they have a high school education or less. Most have blue-collar jobs, and we can see a breakdown here. I also want to note that this chart has a list of unskilled jobs. There are no jobs that are unskilled. That's a social construct. It's a way for folks in more highly skilled or more valued jobs to kind of feel like, oh, my job is more important, right? Every job has some level of skill to them. So here's just kind of a sample of jobs that were held by male offenders. Now, in terms of how the serial killer develops, we know rejection is super important, right? It's the most common theme surrounding the lives of these killers as children, right? And so usually that's going to come from a dysfunctional family, sexual abuse, alcoholism. And so here we can kind of see a breakdown, right? We see 50% of them have experienced rejection, almost 40% an unstable home, mental and emotional abuse, right? I'm sure if you look at this list, this is not particularly surprising. Now, by 2014, we have seen some changes in the choice of weapons, which we saw on this prior slide. about 71% of serial offenders use guns as at least one form of killing, and 46% use them as their sole means of killing. We have a breakdown here of methods and motives, right? So some firearms we can see very popular, also strangulation and suffocation. And then we could see a list of motives here, right? So sometimes they killed because of sex, mostly because of control, right? And then we can see about half is a combination of these motives. We also see kind of a breakdown here of a history of either violent criminal or abnormal behavior. So 63% had some prior incarceration, either in prison or in a psychiatric facility. About 45%, nearly half of them committed property crimes, 38% a sex-related crime, and as you can see, 70% a combination. So what happens to serial killers once they've been caught? So 330 male serial killers in the study were examined for sentencing, and about 30% received the death penalty. At least half are going to spend the rest of their lives in prisons or psychiatric institutions. And even those who technically would be eligible for parole, the odds of any of them being paroled is slim to none. And here we have a breakdown of that, right? We see about 44% getting a prison sentence, almost 30% getting death penalty.